Hey nerds, what's up? So, romantasy is kind of what everyone is talking about these days. The word used for the mashup between the romance and fantasy genres, romantasy has exploded in popularity with hit releases like those authored by Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros, dominating conversations, bookstores, and bestseller lists. But as much as the subgenre is being consumed and gobbled up with glee, there is just as much pushback about junk literature and what romantasy is doing to the fantasy genre in general and what its effects will be. And you know, I can't resist a topic talking about trends in the fantasy genre, right? So we're gonna talk about why romantasy is having a moment right now, what its effects will be on the fantasy genre as a whole, if any, and what you can do about it after the jump. So, is romantasy a trend? Why, yes, but also no. It's certainly having its moment right now, just as much as any trend in any genre has a moment. Many of us are probably old enough that we have lived through several trends in the fantasy genre, particularly trends in YA, which, because I feel like YA fantasy tends to get more popular and be more consumable by more of the masses, tends to really drive a lot of trends. For example, I personally have lived through the influx of dystopian teen media after the success of the Hunger Games. How many monster romances were released after the popularity of Twilight, and of course after the insane success of Harry Potter, how every book somehow needed you to be able to be sorted into something, if not just directly have a fantasy school. Of course, fantasy trends obviously affect adult fantasy too, I just think they often get less attention. However, one of the most well-known and obvious ones was the complete grimdarkification, or the more cynical, darker tone of fantasy that took place after A Song of Ice and Fire, and particularly its adaptation, A Game of Thrones, took off. That was a huge shift in the fantasy genre. I've also started seeing several thought pieces recently on how Sanderson has shifted the fantasy genre as he's become more and more popular, leading conversations around fantasy novels to focus more on magic systems, and has influenced the trend towards more scientific and detailed magic in fantasy novels. And of course, even Tolkien is still being blamed for his effect on the genre, even though he's kind of the so-called father of the modern fantasy genre, with famous authors like Terry Pratchett giving this famous quote in an essay in 1999. J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close. Sometimes it is a shape on the horizon. Sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either has made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. The Lord of the Rings, while English to the bone, was not a typical British fantasy book. It was not part of the mainstream, even though it is now a river in its own right, and has spawned numerous tributaries and has become to define fantasy for many people. And while a lot has changed in the fantasy genre in the last 25 years since that quote, and while we could argue about the veracity of that quote and whether it's true or not, and Pratchett himself might have something else to say about the genre if he was still with us today, the fact remains that fantasy trends have always shaped the genre and will always continue to shape the genre. I've recently been reading Dream Songs by George R. Martin, which is a collection of short stories, and between many of these short stories are his nonfiction essays, and a lot of them ruminate on the vast changes that have happened in the SFF genre over the decades that he's been writing in it. And if there's one thing it's taught me, as long as readings I've had from other authors, is that genres are living, shifting things that are never staying the same. So romantasy is the trend that's having its moment right now. And why is that? And also, why does the pushback seem larger, in my opinion, for this trend than some of the other adult fantasy trends we've seen in the past, which have had pushback, like even the turn to grittier fantasy has seen some pushback, but this one seems louder and more ferocious. One theory for a partial reason that romantasy might be such a big trend right now actually has to do with the trends of reading in general. The National Endowment for the Arts is a US federal agency that's been around since 1965 and often conducts surveys and posts data about reading and other arts activities in the US that I find simply delicious. And one trend that has been around in their data for a while and was present in their most recent publication in 2022 is that women are reading more than men. In the question of adults who read books, novels, short stories, poetry, plays, or listen to audiobooks in 2017, there was a 16% differential between men and women, with 67% of women having read one of those in the past year, compared to 50.7% of men. And in 2022, a 15.5% differential, with 63.1% of women reporting to have read something in the last year, compared to 47.6% of men. This isn't new, by the way. In an old report by the NEA in 2002, similar disparities were shown, with women leading with a 14%, 13%, and an 18% differential in 1982, 1992, and 2002, respectively. As a side note, if you're wondering why it seems like reading rates increased a lot between the 2002 data and the 2022 data, I do have a theory about this because I know we're often told that people are reading less than ever. And while I do think there might have been an uptick in reading, one important thing I noticed is that in the 2002 and previous data, it did not include audiobooks as something that counted, whereas in 2017 and 2022, audiobooks were included in the description, which I think may also contribute since that is a different data collection. So why is this trend important? Well, publishers chase money, and if it's proven that women are buying more books and are shaping that market, then things that generally appeal to women or that women are eager to buy are going to be things that publishers want to publish. And when I was looking around at what some of the best-selling books were of the last 5 years, they do seem to be in female-dominated genres. Lots of romance, lots of thrillers, and literary fiction dominating the scenes. Clearly, Romantasy fits so neatly into this trend. Now, why the larger pushback against Romantasy? I honestly think it might be related to the stats I just mentioned. I think that Romantasy doesn't just represent a tonal shift in the genre, but may also represent a demographic shift in the genre that can feel a little scarier and more threatening to people who are in the fandom and in those spaces. Now, as always, when I talk about trends, I want to make sure we understand that I'm not talking about the individual. In fact, a while ago, I posted this video on my Instagram. I hope I can find it. If I can, I'll place it here.
If you've ever met a boy and wanted to ask what his favorite book is, this video is for you, okay? It's this one. If not, perhaps this one. I'm also betting money that it's probably this one too. And if it's none of those, then you're always safe with this one. And there you go. Now you don't have to ask yourself.
Have you tried this one? Have you tried this one? And then proceeded to list every book that I love. And so I jokingly wrote, oh, today I found out I'm a boy. As individuals, we may have different likes and wants that buck trends, but trends are useful to discuss things overall, and let's just keep that in mind. And with that fact, adult SFF has always been a male-dominated genre. Now, in other videos, I've talked about why children's middle grade and YA often isn't the case and what shifts there, so that's out of the scope of this video today. You can kind of look at some of my other videos where I discuss things like that, but to keep it simple, adult SFF is male-dominated in general. And so Romantasy may feel threatening because it may feel like a complete demographic shift within the genre that will move the genre as a whole away from things that men like. And when you love something how it is and it's important to you, a shift like that may feel scary, especially if you feel like it's a shift that will cause you not to be able to like that thing anymore. So I want to be actually sympathetic to why the Romantasy trend may feel different than other trends and feel more threatening to the genre, but I'm gonna explain why it shouldn't feel threatening and how I don't really think that's what's gonna happen here. At least not in the way that people are worried about. First, like all trends, this is gonna dominate for a set number of years before settling out. Now, it's not like I think Romantasy is suddenly gonna leave. I think it's always gonna be a large genre in its own right. But as pervasive as trends are, trends always change. Trends are always shifting, and it's gonna be no different for this. Plus, Romantasy is really just a new name for something that's always existed. For example, when Twilight came out, no one was calling it Romantasy because that word wasn't really in our lexicon yet, but it clearly was. And people moved on from that, and it just shifted as it's shifting now. Because here's a secret, a lot of this is just about marketing. These words, these phrases, this push, it really is a lot of the times just a marketing ploy. I think it's related to how, because of social media and way things are marketed, things are getting marketed a lot more nicher and nicher, like listing the tropes, listing exactly what you want. And I think that is just kind of a thing that's relatively new, and this is a symptom of that. It's also important to understand the positive outcome here, because at least with a lot of the Romantasy readers I know, is that a lot of them are shifting from Romantasy to just regular plain old fantasy that's already existing in the genre. So what I'm about to say is anecdotal, so it's not science-based or research-based or anything, but I do have a lot of friends in my real life who've gotten super into Romantasy. And something I've kind of noticed and sensed is that a lot of these women were people who loved fantasy as a kid and maybe felt intimidated by the adult fantasy genre for whatever reason. They felt intimidated to start. They saw that maybe it was male dominated. They heard that maybe the books weren't really for them, and they didn't know how to get into it. So Romantasy was a really safe landing spot. It was clearly marketed towards them. It was clearly a group and community effort that everyone was rallying around. And I've seen these friends start in Romantasy and read a ton of Romantasy, and then a lot of them start pivoting to Red Rising. Sanderson is a really common one as well. I have a friend who was super into Romantasy, and then she was like asking me for stuff and found out I liked Song of Ice and Fire, and then read that whole thing and loved it. Okay, so a lot of the times this is just like a new entry point into just our regular fantasy genre. And I think that should only be seen as a huge positive thing, because as our genre gains more attention and gains more readers and more fans, it probably means better stuff for us. I feel like a lot of my videos these days are just like, be calm, it's gonna be okay. And I just think that's a function of the internet economy, because I think the internet tends to have a short memory, a short news cycle, and extreme opinions just get the most attention. They're attention grabbing, they're easy to see. So people who are in love with something and people who are hating something and are worried about it are dominating conversations. And there's just like not a lot of past reflection about how trends and genres are just run of the mill. And this one might not be a trend you love, but the next one might. You can dislike something personally and not feel the need to criticize others who enjoy it. I think as a fandom in SFF, we of anybody should be sympathetic to people dismissing our genre as frivolous and stupid and not for adults and for children, when we know the depth that is found and the importance that is found in our genre. So for us to turn around and do that to Romantasy feels a little hypocritical and feels like these are the people we want. We want to convert them. We don't want to, and you're never going to convert someone by saying the stuff they like is trash. You convert them by saying, you loved that? Great, try this. And look, right now it might feel like there's not a lot of new books being published in the kind of books that you like, but I did a video on how many freaking books are being published every year. There is something for you being published, because literally so many books are being published, whether self-published or traditionally published. Additionally, beyond that, there are decades and decades and decades of excellent SFF for you to read. And if you're like, but I've read all the old stuff. No, you haven't. You've read all the popular old stuff, but there are decades worth of stuff for you to explore. Pick a decade that had a trend you liked, and there are still books for you to read. Like recently, I've been disappointed with a lot of new releases, and so I just go find a new George R. R. Martin book to read, and I'm happy. Anyway, long story short, Romantasy is a trend just like any trend that's in fantasy, and it is going to ebb and flow, and I don't think it spells some like giant permanent shift in our genre, although it might represent a shift of demographics that I don't think will be a bad thing, and that there's always plenty of books for you to read and love, even if the new trend doesn't work out for you. I would love your thoughts on this. I would love your thoughts on Romantasy in general. If you're a Romantasy reader, I would love to know if you were a Romantasy reader that got into fantasy. If you want recommendations, I'm always here for you. As always, if you like these kind of deep dives and video essays in the book community, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.